Dueling genre.
In the world of Hollywood, movies get greenlit and redlit. They get remade and rebooted. But we are the Ideal. I'm Sam Gasch, and you are listening to Ideal Remake. Thank you for listening to Ideal Remake. We take movies that either have been, will be, or should be remade and talk about what the ideal version of that remake would be. And it's the end of season 7. I've done 7 seasons of this podcast, and wrapping up here at the end of 2024. The end of 2024, in exclusively Ideal Remake podcast terms, means that I have done 163 different movie remakes. 2 of those are lost episodes for various reasons, but they still exist. They still happened. That's over 160 different movie remakes that you can go back and listen to right now. That's amazing, and anyone who's listening, thank you, especially for this yearly end-of-year wrap-up episode that I like to do. Thank you. I like doing this. I love having these conversations. I like talking about movies. I like being made to watch movies I otherwise might never watch. I really like doing this podcast, you guys, and it's so much work, it's so much effort, but the fact that I get to do it is still so cool to me. So now I'm going to do the thing that I like doing at the end of every season, which is to go back and thank every single person who contributed their time to be my guest. And season 7 began with a remake of Time Cop. Time Cop was a wild movie, first of all. Just it was a super fun action movie that was incredibly stupid, but in the best way. And I remade that with my friend Ian. Ian Ager, I met on strike. Ian is, like me, not a professional writer, but also like me, he took and contributed the time to be there at Radford as often as CBS Radford, Studio Radford, technically CBS Studios Radford, whatever. To be there so often despite having work and other things to do and just fighting for a future for an entertainment industry that we both want to be a part of, but even if we can't, it's still worth fighting for. And Ian is a great guy, an incredible Magic the Gathering player, and apparently Warhammer now too. Ian, stop it. But Ian had me watch Time Cop, and it is just so silly. I'm completely blanking on the name of the lead. It's Jean-Claude Van Damme. And he does the splits, he goes through time, it makes no sense if you think about it, and a dude gets turned into goo. What more could you possibly want? Time Cop. What a picture. And then episode 2 of the season was God of Gamblers that I remade with Dianne Bloom. Dianne has a real knack for picking out interesting movies that, again, otherwise I wouldn't have seen. And Dianne actually has been wanting to do God of Gamblers for a little while, but kept getting distracted by other things. So I think Dianne actually got God of Gamblers confused with a different movie, but this ended up being the one we watched. It was really interesting because it was an amnesia movie. God of Gamblers is a Hong Kong action comedy. So that alone makes it just worthwhile having a conversation about. And then the way we got to just get in there and figure out, because obviously we would end up doing a stylized version of an American remake, just because I certainly don't know enough about the Hong Kong cinematic landscape to name actors. But this movie started its own kind of God of Gamblers cinematic universe. And to get to see where that started and what instigated it, it's an incredibly silly movie. And Dianne had me watch it. Dianne's been on the show so many times and is great. She's probably not going to be on the show as often now because Dianne has now moved to New York. But if you're listening, hi Dianne. I hope you're having a nice time in New York. I hope you're in New York when this comes out. I don't know if you are, but either way, hi! The 3rd episode was the first DCOM that I think I've covered on the show, which is interesting because I have threatened doing an all Disney Channel original movie season. I don't think season 8 is going to be it, but someday I will do that. And this is the first DCOM I've covered on the show. My guest for remaking Xenon Girl of the 21st Century was Celeste Klaus, which, makes sense for this time of year, what with it being festive and all. Celeste is another incredible writer that I met on strike at Radford. And Celeste is, what's the show she's working on? It's an Apple TV show called Acapulco. And the strike happened, and that meant that Celeste missed her opportunity to go to Acapulco for filming, or wherever their on-site filming location was. And she was there holding the sign, being in the picket. So Celeste is an incredibly cool person and obviously a great writer. And we got to talk about silliness and Xenon and DCOMs and replacing children with robots and everything you could hope for in a Disney Channel original movie episode. And then this season began with a lot of amazing writers that I met while on strike, and the next writer is no exception. Micki Boden, I met, actually not at Radford, I met Micki at Warner Brothers, and they're an amazing writer. They won a WGA award this year for their work on The Floor. I don't remember, but they're obviously a great writer, and Micki is so passionate and caring about like social causes and the things that need to be better in the world, but they enjoy silliness as much as anyone else, and that's why we remade the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie True Lies. Now, apparently True Lies has been remade before, but not well. And like, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's Jamie Lee Curtis. What more could you ask for? And the answer is whatever Micki and I said we needed, because it's just very silly to get to talk about this movie. And obviously, because wrestling is a thing that Micki truly loves, we absolutely had some wrestlers in our remake of True Lies. The episode after that is a mainstay of Ideal Remake because he is the guy who runs the Dueling Genre Network. Scott Carelli was back because he realized that Somewhere in Time might be a perfect movie to talk about on this show, and he was right. Somewhere in Time is a Christopher Reeve movie where he, basically he falls in love with this woman after being given a watch by her older self 50 years later, and he falls in love with this woman when he goes back to kind of track down this idea of her. And that love allows him to travel back in time and be with this woman that he truly admired and fell in love with. And it's not a rom-com, it's just a true romance movie. And that is part of why, unfortunately, it didn't do very well, because people look at him and just see Superman. But, if this movie had come out before Superman, it would have been the perfect audition tape for him to play Clark Kent. And Christopher Reeve is one of the best was one of the best at doing that. He is was an incredibly compassionate, caring person, and that came across in the movie. And Scott's been to Mackinac Island where the movie was filmed, or at least Scott's wife Bethany has been there, and it's an island where cars aren't allowed, and it's just cool. And just honestly, some of the lore behind this movie is more interesting than the movie itself. But then, of course, the movie's very sweet, and we got to kind of completely reinvent it. And I think both of us were incredibly pleased with what each other brought to the process, that we ended up with a Somewhere in Time that I think we're both very happy with, and we would both happily work on this movie. But yeah, Somewhere in Time. That was episode 149. Which means that episode 150 was the next one. And for that, I knew I needed an all-star team. So I brought back two guests, Kevin Mosteller and Amanda Barnes. I met these two through the Nerdist Improv School, which does not exist anymore. And they are some of the funniest, most creative people I have the pleasure of saying I know and am friends with. Kevin is also an incredible composer and musician. Amanda is a writer and is very funny. So much so that I now need to go and find the name of the movie that she wrote that came out this year. The movie is called Just Like a Christmas Movie. And apparently there's also a version called Waking Up to Christmas. But Just Like a Christmas Movie is a movie that Amanda wrote that came out this year. And she did it. She wrote a movie and they made it. And that's awesome. And let's all go celebrate. And then in the meantime, we talked about Metropolis, which is a movie that is also so deep in just the lore of itself. Because I think Metropolis is probably going to be the oldest movie I ever cover on this show. It's probably not the first ever science fiction movie, but certainly one of the most impactful science fiction movies of all time. It's a dystopian future, and it's the working class rising up against the upper class, and just the nature of what that is. And oh my goodness, it's just what a piece of cinematic history, and the absolute gall I have to think that I can remake that. But I don't have that gall. I think I can remake that, but only with the help of my friends. And boy, that was a long conversation, but like every minute of it was great. Like going through and editing and trying to figure out cuts, I'm like, I can't cut any of this. This is all good conversation because we're figuring out what this movie is. And I love that. So how do you follow up one of the most important cinematic pieces of our history? You follow it up with one of the silliest. Tanner Vogelsang was back to talk about Battle Beyond the Stars. They wanted to talk about this movie because it is just like this campy silliness that is Star Wars, Seven Samurai, 80s, Roger Corman, schlock, banana, crazy, wackadoo, terrible movie, but like wildly entertaining because of its ridiculousness. Like, what if Star Wars was a like real war film where you got to see the ramifications and the consequences of like space trench warfare? And I don't know what tipped Tanner off to talk about this movie, but they were right to want to talk about it. And Battle Beyond the Stars is so silly. I don't know what to say other than track this movie down and watch it with friends. Don't watch it alone, because I think that would be a mistake. But watching it with other people, making fun of it, having a bad movie night is the ideal way to watch this movie. So of course, when Tanner and I had to talk about it, what are we going to do to remake it in such a way? Well, we have to also be true to what it's remaking and what it is, but also try to stay silly, but also make it good. And oh man, this might have been one of the tougher movies I think that we did this year, but obviously Tanner and I did an awesome job. Tanner's been on the show before and always brings their A game. And yeah, I don't know. It's as a separate thought. Tanner is currently on a season of a podcast called Binary Break that is written, edited, and ran by also former guest of the show, Claire Mulcairn. She is playing DM, and Tanner is playing a Digimon and a partner in the second season of the show where they're like going to the digital world, but they're teenagers and angst. And Binary Break, there's an episode out once a month, and it is so good, and y'all gotta listen to it. Of course, in addition to the work that Tanner is doing on Not If I Reboot You First, which is kind of like a sibling podcast to Ideal Remake, but Not If I Reboot You First will cover TV, movies, video games, anything. I think I tried to reboot movie theaters in an episode, and they were very kind enough to humor me. So after Battle Beyond the Stars, let's bring it back home, but let's still keep it weird. Jon Guttierez is a writer I met through Andra Whipple at a writer just check-in kind of thing that we did at Idle Hour. And Jon told me about the WJ board game group. And then I kind of became better friends with Jon by attending the WGA board game group, which was super fun. And I love that group. That group is so great. And so I asked Jon what he wanted to talk about on the podcast. And he wanted to talk about the Twilight Zone movie, which is really like 4 movies in one, maybe 5. It's a lot. It's let's say 4.5, because it's 4 different vignettes and then like kind of the thing that ties them all together. And I kind of just had to sit back and let Jon go. Jon knows so much about Twilight Zone and writing and different things. Jon is my favorite kind of nerd. Someone who knows everything and then isn't necessarily precious about it. So we were able to take Jon's knowledge of Twilight Zone and use it to help us come up with a new, interesting version, because we are kind of doing 4.5 remakes in one episode. And I think we figured it out. Some are closer, some are further away, just because that's just the nature of what the Twilight Zone movie is. And yeah, I still think Battle Beyond the Stars is a more difficult remake because I had to do more. For Twilight Zone the movie, I kind of just sat back and relaxed as Jon was like, oh, we can pull from this specific Twilight Zone episode from 1960 whatever, and that's what we can use as the basis for our version of the remake. I'm like, yeah, great, whatever you just said. That sounds amazing. After that, I had my friend Raye Pettigrew come on to talk about Dazed and Confused, the Richard Linklater movie that takes place in Texas, in the town where Raye grew up. So Raye was like the perfect person to talk about this movie, which I think is why he picked it. Dazed and Confused is very much a movie of its time, but also of its place, because there are a lot of different aspects of the 8th grade rising to freshman of high school, like, experience in, I think it's Austin, Texas, where, like, it's unique to that town, and it doesn't happen anywhere else, and it might still be happening, might not really, because, like, hazing began early, and it's very much a slice of life of, like, here's what this time in your lives is going to be. And I think movies like that are important. I think these small, mid-budget to small-budget movies are so important because I'm sure there's an element of spectacle just because it is a movie, but, like, fundamentally, these are the places where you can be so personable and close to the characters themselves. And Raye and I really worked on that and made that important for our version of our remake, because we had to talk about who these people are. And because there are a lot of aspects of the characters that haven't aged necessarily very well, we had to come up with new versions of these characters, and I think we did it. And I just think it was really cool to have that kind of conversation where we really get personal with the characters. So, of course, you follow that up with a movie that is absolutely bananas silly. Alex Caine has been on and exclusively remade video game movies. And there are plenty more for us still to go, but this time we talked about Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time, which I'm sorry to say is not a good movie, and not just because it takes, hey, here's a movie that takes place in Persia and that part of the world, let's cast almost exclusively white people. Yeah! And according to Alex, do very little that's actually related to the video games, but that was good for Alex to know, because then we got to sort of base things on the video game. And I guess that just is what we had to do. Alex is a fantastic stand-up comedian. If you're ever in LA and need to see a stand-up show, you can go to Alex's Instagram, Food and Hippos, which is all one word, which is how Instagram works. And you can see when he's going to next be at Flappers. And he's at Flappers, I think, every Friday. And just kind of does good comedy work. And then we get to bring that and infuse it into the remake of Prince of Persia. I don't really talk about this that often, but Alex and I occasionally do this other podcast of ours called Poke Battle Bros, where we talk about different, like, Poke Draft Leagues, which is a whole separate thing, but if you are super into Pokemon, as Alex and I are, you can go and listen to that podcast, and it's so fun. After that, once again, it was time to get serious. I like to bounce back and forth, because we have to talk about one of those movies that everyone else had seen, but I had never seen. Because Dana Braziel-Solovy came on the show to remake Gangs of New York. And y'all, we did our best to make it gay. And we made it female and sapphic, and we did our absolute best. Because, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to try and recapture the performance of Bill the Butcher as it exists? No. You're going to try to do something that captures the spirit of what the movie is, but tell it in a different way that is new and interesting and compelling, that while I understand there was so much racism going on at the time, we don't need that. We don't need to do that racism again without like hanging a hat on it and saying how absolutely terrible it is. Dana is an incredibly passionate person, and she and I are going to be putting together a script showcase that's going to be happening in February. So if you are an agent, manager, or producer and want to come check that out, hit me up, because I'm going to do that. Obviously, I'll be sending out invites mid-January as well. But after that, Dana is another awesome writer that I met on strike. I met Dana. Dana is art department and also an awesome writer. And Dana made these incredible pins that would she would just hand them out to anybody on the strike line. So she made so many pins that she broke her pin maker, and people like pooled resources to buy her another one. Dana is wildly pro-union, and it's great, and vote union, everybody. Following that up was another awesome writer that I met. You know what? I met Matt Harry at the same event where literally the same night I met Jon Guttierez, but I became friends with Matt the exact same way as Jon, through the WGA board game group. Matt has a book series called the Codex Arcanum. The first one is Sorcery for Beginners, the second one is Cryptozoology for Beginners, and this third one that just came out is Time Traveler for Beginners. And it is next on my to-read list. I supported it on Kickstarter. I'm very excited to read it. I promised some other books that I would read first, so those are what's happening now. But Matt, I'm going to get to your book, I promise. And the promise is, when you make it, is just as good as you can keep it. Because Matt and I remade Popeye. And Popeye is one of those weird moments where, like, the movie itself is less than the sum of its parts. Because the set design is incredible. The casting is incredible. All of these people are giving incredible performances. And unfortunately, it just doesn't quite work. But, like, Robin Williams as Popeye, Shelley Duvall as Olive Oil, like, it's brilliant casting. And they do so good. And, like, the town, they built a town for this movie. And it's still there because they did such a good job. It's a Disney movie. It's like Disney and Universal or something, and it's like the one time they've teamed up to do a movie like this, and like maybe the one out of 2 times that it's ever happened. But, oh man, Matt and I just had so much fun just doing the whole time. And, Popeye. The movie after that sucked. Not because of Jake Hoolihan. No, Jake is an incredible guest, and they are welcome back at any time. But Wizards is not a good movie. It is a Ralph Bakshi animated movie from the 70s, and it is truly awful. It's racist, it's sexist, it's, oh man. But, like, the idea is good. I met Jake also through the strike, but not necessarily through the strike, because Jake was a strike captain, I believe, over at Disney, which I didn't go to that often. But post-strike, at another union rally, I think a rally for IATSE, that's where I first met them. And then also through Dana, I kind of became more friendly with Jake at a League of Women Writers networking mixer that happens every month. And I was talking to them, and the concept of this podcast came up, and Jake was like, that's such a cool idea. I'd love to be on that. And then, like, we were trying to figure out what movies to cover, and the 2 movies that Jake requested were this movie, Wizards, and the movie that I then covered next with my next guest. And I was like, can I cover that one with the next guest? And Jake was like, yes, and fell on the sword of Wizards. And we talked about this truly horrendous movie. But because the movie's so bad, but still has a good idea, that gave us so much room to play. And we took this pile of crap and made something truly great. And it proves just how good a writer Jake is, just because, like, they brought me this terribleness, and together we made gold. We turned crap into gold. And it's awesome. And don't watch the movie, but listen to our episode, Wizards, y'all. What a thing that exists. So the other movie that had been up is a movie called Stay Tuned. I loved Stay Tuned. Loved Stay Tuned. I'd never seen it before this recording. Stay Tuned it's like The Last Action Hero, but for TV. John Ritter basically plays a couch potato, and the devil shows up and offers him a remote with a super cable package and 666 channels because the devil. And then John Ritter and his wife get sucked in and into the TV, and they have to then escape all the different channels without getting killed. And it's very silly, very fun. And yeah, that was great. So I remade Stay Tuned with Dan Peck. Dan, it's his first time on the show, and I think became better friends with Dan because of the strike, but I first met Dan years ago at a party of another mutual friend of ours, another friend who I met through a Nerdist, the Nerdist improv school, which ended up not being related to the Nerdist, whatever. Jordan Pridgeon was the host of that party, and that's how I know Dan. Dan is an incredible writer. He wrote on American Dad and a bunch of other stuff, and Dan wanted to be on the show mid-October so that it could coincide with the release of his new podcast, Good Chaotic, which is an actual play podcast with an amazing cast where it's based on the Scum and Villainy, but isn't, and Dan is DMing and taking them through this incredible sci-fi story where basically all of the stars in the universe have gone out except for one. Everyone is headquartered on a floating space station at the end of the universe. When all hope is lost, look to the last light in the universe, look to the lighthouse. And it's very good. I've listened to every episode, and I really like it. And if you like sci-fi and nerdy space stuff, Dan's hosting a great show, and you'll enjoy that. I closed out Spooky Month with Scott Carelli returning to the show, and Scott realized that I had never talked about Ghostbusters. And we were both like, that's weird. That feels like that's a movie I should have covered by now, because it is an awesome movie in its own right and has absolutely been remade sort of, like twice. And so Scott and I had like a 2-hour-long conversation about Ghostbusters, because how do you remake Ghostbusters and don't just do like the same thing again or the same thing but worse, which has kind of happened. And so we kind of had to get back to the core basics of what Ghostbusters was at the time and what the version of that now would be. And I think we did it. Like, both of us kind of got to the end of the episode and we were like, oh man, this would work as a Ghostbuster. Like, the two movies that Scott and I remade this year, Somewhere in Time and Ghostbusters, I think both of us are like, our versions of these movies should exist. They're pretty good. Hey, producers and studios, please hire us to make these, because these movies will work, they'll sell, and it's going to be great. So, yeah. After that was returning guest Semien Abay. Semien was previously on for Beverly Hills Ninja, and this time she wanted to talk about Ella Enchanted. And Ella Enchanted was an interesting movie I'd never seen before, but I'd seen like the trailers and the commercials and everything. And apparently there's a real divide between people who enjoy the movie, seen the movie, whatever, and people who read the book that it's based on, because apparently it's very different. There's a lot of changes, and not changes that the book lovers appreciate. So we had that conversation. We tried to make Ella Enchanted as close to the book as it had been, and we did our best, and we came up with an Ella Enchanted that I hope we both can be proud of. And yeah, that's what we did. After that was, I think, the third episode that my friend Corsica Wilson has been on for. So that's the Ideal Remake hat trick, Corsica. Congratulations. Corsica wanted to talk about another Audrey Hepburn movie, Two for the Road. Corsica has previously talked about Sherlock Jr. and then How to Steal a Million. And this time we got to play with one of the lesser known Audrey Hepburn movies, to the point where we don't even know if it was like a financial success, because it's like a character drama about this couple that really should get divorced, but then like doesn't. And it jumps around in time at different stages and points in their life. And we had to figure out exactly what it is about those stages and points in life, and like how this movie, when it was remade, translates to making that movie now. Because these movies, when they exist, are contemporary, so it would need to be, it should be contemporary or roundabouts when we try to make it. I don't know if we made it completely contemporary, but pretty close. And Corsica loves classic movies and loves Audrey Hepburn, and just getting a chance to dive into more of her catalog of incredible movies is an awesome thing to do. And just because I like to brag about my friends, when I was visiting my family for Thanksgiving, sitting, watching football or the Puppy Bowl or something, and I guess not the Puppy Bowl, the Westminster Dog Show, and a Dunkin' Donuts commercial came on, and I got to point everyone to the screen. I said, hey, that's Corsica. That's my friend in that commercial. And it was awesome, and I texted Corsica, like, we just saw your Dunkin' Donuts commercial, and she was like, that's fun. Anyway, it was great, and I think Corsica also was the host for our last movie club, and we watched Go, which was also great. Corsica is a very good writer, a good producer, a good actress, a true triple threat, and also her cats are cool. So yeah, fun episode, very much happy to have made that. And there were 2 episodes left in season 7. The next was a movie that, wildly, I'd seen before, I think at Movie Club, because Ian Webb came on to talk about Zardoz. Now, I had previously guested on Ian's podcast. Movies So Bad They're Good, Midnight Cult Classics in Camp is Ian's old podcast. And I'd been on that show to talk about Vampire's Kiss, and we talked about that movie and had fun and goofed around and talked about another wild movie. But Ian is kind of become a weird expert on Zardoz, because basically any podcast where he gets the opportunity to talk about Zardoz, he does it because it's such a weird movie that he likes making people watch. And we talked about this movie 2 days after the election. And so it was, interesting thing for us to talk about, because it's a movie that is a dystopian future movie where the world is split into the haves and have-nots and all of the things that means. And so, incredibly current, very valid, and it's the haves, the rich people, making the poor people fight amongst themselves. They make us fight a culture war so we don't fight a class war. That's what's happening in this movie, but the movie's not being done very well, so we had plenty to work with. Ian was a very fun guest. I was glad Ian came on to make me watch again this very silly, goofy movie. And yeah, there ended up being more for us to play with than I thought there would be. And especially at that time, I really needed to have a conversation and see if we can have a conversation about a movie where we make the world better instead of worse. So I very much needed that movie at that time. And Ian, once again, thank you so much for making me watch Zardoz, you absolute madman. And then there was last week's episode, the end of season 7. My friend Yousif Nash was on to remake Ang Lee's The Hulk. Now, Yousif is also a great writer, and I did not meet Yousif on strike, I don't think, but I met Yousif in all of the little things I've done in the last year or so post-strike, because Yousif and I are both very good at hey, there's a writer event or a genre committee meeting or something going on, and we both go to those, so we just keep seeing each other, and now we know each other, now we're friends, and now I know how good at writing and creative Yousif is, because we get to play around and remake a movie about one of, if not his favorite superheroes. A superhero who hasn't really had a movie do him justice. And Yousif is weirdly experienced with radioactivity and all this other stuff. And so it was just kind of this perfect element of getting to talk about an action movie that was very fun, very silly, while also making it so, and making our version of it work. Plus, I'd never seen any The Hulk movie before, and as someone who enjoys Marvel stuff, after I'm done recording and editing this episode, I'm going to go back and watch more Agatha All Along. I enjoy Marvel things. I like good Marvel movies. This wasn't one. This was a bad movie, but we had an opportunity to make it good, and I don't know if that's something either of us is ever going to have a true opportunity to do, but we got to for this episode, and we got to do a Marvel. We got to make a Hulk movie, and that was dope. So, to every single one of you who was my guest for this season, thank you so much. I can't make this show without guests. I've been talking for a long time, and that's cool. But if I ever try to do these episodes, remake these movies on my own, it's not going to be the same without the input from all of these awesome writers. Like, I show up for these recordings and I have a cast list and maybe a vague idea, but that's it. My guests will sometimes bring outlines and beat sheets, and because they all want to come in and remake a movie the best they can. And I'm always just so excited to like have the conversation and figure these things out together. And the fact that people do homework and give their time to me to make this show will forever mean so much to me. So to every single guest, genuinely, so much, thank you. And to anyone who's listening, anyone who's ever listened to an episode, who's certainly made it this far into this episode, my goodness, thank you. I love every single one of you. I hope I hope that I can continue making something that you enjoy. I hope that I can make things that you continue to enjoy in all sorts of different mediums. And yeah, I like doing this show, y'all, and I'm so excited that it's a thing that I'm allowed to do. So thank you for listening to Ideal Remake. If you're interested in following me on social medias, I am on Instagram at Ideal Remake, spelled like the podcast. Or you can follow me on BlueSky at Sam Gasch, SamGasch. I'm going to go on hiatus for a few months because my January through March are always super duper crazy, but I'm excited to come back after that sometime. And if you want to talk to me or suggest movies or do anything, in the show notes for this episode, there is a link to the Dueling Genre Discord, which is a wonderful Discord. I love being on it. I get to be silly. I get to talk about movies and TV and video games and random stuff, and people post pictures of their cats and dogs. It's one of the best corners of the internet, and I love being there. But I feel like I should end this episode the same way I end every episode. What is my favorite quote from Season 7 of Ideal Remake? And I feel like the answer has gotta be... See ya in Season 8.